little rough around the edges, but good.
Heard about a job. Big shot gangster putting together a crew.
I'm a driver, and I'm a flyer. I waited a long time for a shot like this.
What do you think? Well, what do you know?
You got a line on a ship?
Yeah, I know a guy. He's the best smuggler around.
I heard a story about you. I was wondering if it's true.
Everything you've heard about me is true.
L3!
Let go of the mean man's face.
Who are these guys?
Welcome to Kermode Uncut. Solo, a Star Wars story, is, as you know, currently in cinemas. One of the interesting things about that film, whether you like it or not, is there's been a lot of discussion about how much it matters that Ron Howard took over the project halfway through the filming. The film started off with Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who are the guys that made the Lego movie. They were directing, and then halfway through the shoot, or actually quite a long way into the shoot, they left the project, somewhat under a cloud. The exact circumstances aren't entirely clear, and Ron Howard took over. And apparently he reshot up to 70% of the movie. No one's quite clear who did what, but it was a movie which changed directors midstream. Now, in the past, this has often been seen as a recipe for tragedy, but that's not always the case. If you look back at films like The Wizard of Oz, had umpteen different directors turn out perfectly fine in the end, didn't it? Gone with the Wind started filming under George Cukor and ended up with Victor Fleming, and of course that worked out pretty well. And famously, Spartacus. Stanley Kubrick was not the first director on Spartacus. When Spartacus began, it was Anthony Mann, and then Kirk Douglas had him removed and replaced by Stanley Kubrick, and all those movies turned out to be big hits. Bohemian Rhapsody, the forthcoming film about Queen, began filming with Bryan Singer. It's now being finished by Dexter Fletcher. Who knows how it's going to turn out, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be bad just because the directors change midstream. And throughout the history of cinema, there are plenty of examples of this. Brave started out being directed by Brenda Chapman, ended up being directed by Mark Andrews, and in fact there are loads and loads of animated movies in which we get a change of director midstream. Richard Donner famously started Superman 2, but didn't finish it. Richard Lester finished it, and then later on there was that reconstructed Richard Donner's original version. One of the most famous cases of this is that Paul Schrader made the prequel to The Exorcist that was then so terrible that the company dumped it and made a whole other movie directed by Rennie Harlin called Exorcist the Beginning. And then that was so terrible that they allowed Schrader to finish his original version as Dominion, a prequel to The Exorcist. Two completely separate films, two completely separate directors, both absolutely terrible. Now sometimes, of course, there's a case when a director will take over from another director but doesn't want credit for a movie, so they use a pseudonym. So, for example, Death of a Gunfighter started out being filmed by Robert Totten, ended up being filmed by Don Siegel. Neither of them wanted to take credit for the film, so they invented a pseudonym, Alan Smithy, which became the pseudonym which was used whenever a director had their name removed from a film. The Directors Guild agreed to it, so if you saw an Alan Smithy film, it was a film that a director had disowned or taken their name off. And that worked until Joe Eszterhas scripted a film called Burn Hollywood Burn, an Alan Smithy movie. In that film, which was directed by Arthur Hiller, Eric Idle played a filmmaker called Alan Smithy, who makes a movie and wants to have their name removed from it, but discovers that if they have their name removed from it, it'll be credited to Alan Smithy. And then, in a frankly baffling turn of events, Arthur Hiller wanted to take his name off an Alan Smithy movie. So he did, and it was credited to Alan Smithy, an Alan Smithy movie, directed by Alan Smithy, at which point the Directors Guild said, enough, we're not doing this anymore. And I'm with them.